Welcome to the Ash Cloud. I'm Ash Sweeting. Today we are joined by Peer Ederer. Peer is the founding director of Goal Sciences, whose research supports global food policy. At Zeppelin University, his work focuses on the links between innovation, new technologies and economic growth in global food systems. Peer's research into the role of livestock in global food systems highlights the complexity of both reducing the environmental burden of animal production and providing the global population a nutritious diet.
The largest challenge by a distance is the fact that as of today, more than 50% of the global population is undernourished, do not have the right amount of food nutrients on their dish. We do not have a shortage, by and large, we do not have a shortage of food calories, but we have a shortage of food nutrients. And this is a problem that cuts right across all societies. So we have rich and wealthy societies where a significant portion of the population is not properly nourished. And obviously this extends all the way down to middle-income countries and to low-income countries.
Traditional methods are proven to work.
We have a solution to this. And the solution, the technology that has been able to feed the world properly over the thousands of years and has been to use animals, to use livestock animals.
Recent changes need addressing.
Over the last few decades, not centuries, but decades, we've been running into two issues here. The one issue is that keeping animals has been economically expensive. And the second aspect is that with the growing number of animals, we have come into contact with environmental barriers where some of these production forms of these animals are creating severe environmental burdens.
We cannot afford to ignore smallholder family farms.
So the majority of the animals are being bred and maintained and fed in family-sized operations. Now, of course, in some countries, especially like United States or also Brazil, you have these mega farms with 30,000 animals, 50,000, in a few cases even 100,000 animals. But that's still the exception. Most animal farming is in small decentralized operations around the world. And that actually creates quite a lot of resilience.
The further we move away from natural systems, the greater the risk.
As in any monoculture, whether you do cane sugar plantations that cover, the areas of entire countries, wheat monoculture plantations or banana monoculture plantations. If you have an animal monoculture situation, you run the risk of creating an environmental hazard. So the larger the concentration of an agricultural production is, and that applies to plants and for animals, the higher is the risk of an environmental hazard unfolding. That's not to say that these cannot be mitigated.
Empathy is critical.
All sides really want the same thing. I don't know a single farmer who is out there saying, well, I intentionally ruin my land because I don't care what comes after me. And the same is also for industry. I don't see that agribusiness industry is a short-term exploiter of, the devil may care what comes after me.
Communicating with the public must become a priority. Traditionally,
The meat industry has been reluctant to communicate. It's a traditional posture of the meat industry not to talk with the public. They really don't quite know how to talk with the general public. They're kind of learning how to do this. because they've now seen that they're performing a vital function for society, but society has reduced, or in some cases maybe even totally withdrawn, the social license to operate. And without a social license to operate, you cannot operate a business, whether it's legal or not.
Alternative proteins have a role.
The overall challenge to create, to have a more micronutrient-rich nutrition on our tables is so large that we should not be discounting or should not be pushing away any single method for it. So overall, it is to be welcomed and to be appreciated. Now, having said that, we also need to understand what are the likely technological limitations to this over the next, foreseeable 20 to 30 years.
The environmental impacts of our food systems are multidimensional.
Then these impacts happen along 4 different dimensions, or mainly 4 different dimensions. So one dimension is biodiversity, one dimension is soil health, the third dimension is water management, and the fourth is climate. Every kind of animal, so poultry, pigs, and cattle, they have different types of impacts, both negative and positive impacts, along each of the 4 dimensions.
Embracing simplistic solutions is a huge risk.
We need to accept that this is complex, and that if we do not appreciate and respect that complexity, we're most likely get wrong solutions that come and bite us in other ways.
Hello, Peer. Thank you very much for joining me today.
Thank you, Ash, for having me as an interview partner here.
Future food strategies and the opportunities and challenges that the world is facing in this space. That's an area that you've been focusing on, or you focus on, and it's becoming ever more complex. Can you tell us a bit about an overview of how you see that and where the opportunities and challenges lie?
The largest challenge by a distance is the fact that as of today, more than 50% of the global population is undernourished, do not have the right amount of food nutrients on their dish. We do not have a shortage, by and large, we do not have a shortage of food calories, but we have a shortage of food nutrients. And this is a problem that cuts right across all societies. So we have rich and wealthy societies where a significant portion of the population is not properly nourished. And obviously this extends all the way down to middle-income countries and to low-income countries, where large portions of the population do not have proper nutritious food on their plate. And that is the largest challenge that we have worldwide.
So what are the opportunities to actually address that challenge? And are there any specific areas in terms of nutrients that are of greater concern or of greater importance than others?
On balance, you can say it strikes all the higher value nutrients. So we're talking about the vitamins, we're talking about minerals, and of course we're talking about proteins. So anything that is not just an energy supply in terms of either carbohydrates or fats, of which we have enough, but proteins, minerals, vitamins, and also fibers. We're short of that across the board and the global dish.
So you mentioned that there was over 50% of the world's population is undernourished, and it's not necessarily linked. It's in wealthy countries and middle-income countries and poorer countries. The same challenges. Is there a one-size-fits-all solution, or do we need to look at this in different approaches for different countries depending on their income level globally?
Yeah, so income does play a role, obviously. The poorer the country is, the poorer the society is, and the poorer a population segment is, the worse the nutritional situation becomes. We need to look at this in a differentiated way, not only by income, but also by climate zones, by religious and cultural backgrounds. So for sure, there is no one size fits all situation whatsoever. This needs to be looked at country by country, region by region, culture by culture. Even within countries, you will need to look for different solutions in the cities than in the rural countryside. So we need a wide portfolio of different solutions to address that's nutrient undersupply.
One of the things a former interviewer on my podcast, on the Ash Club podcast, said to me, a man called Richard Eckhart at the University of Melbourne, he said that less than or fewer than 10% of the world's population actually has a choice on what they eat every single day. That 90% plus of the world's population, they eat essentially what they can either afford to get or physically can manage to have available where they live. Is that consistent with your research and your understanding of the world's nutritional challenges?
So 10% sounds a little bit small to me. I think, I mean, if you think 8 billion people, out of that 800 million will live in Northern America and Europe. Then we have East Asian people as well. And granted, not all of them have free food choice, but I think the group of people in Latin America, in Asia, that has the choice to eat a good meal, I would not put it at just 800 million, or put it about as twice as that. So let's say 20%. But that's still a low number, right? I mean, I don't want to go into hair splitting whether we're talking about 10 or 20%. Even if it's 20%, it's too low. That would still mean that 80% of the people do not have a choice to eat. And out of that 80%, probably 20 to 30 percentage points may not have a choice, but they still nonetheless are well fed, so they have a sufficient meal. And that leaves then about the 50% that does not have a sufficient meal in front of them.
And in terms of the innovation that's required to address this huge challenge, if you've got this high percentage of the population who are underfed, what sort of innovation is needed in that space?
Well, we have a solution to this. And the solution, the technology that has been able to feed the world properly over the thousands of years and has been to use animals, to use livestock animals. So it's not so much that we need a new innovation in the methodology itself. We know what the methodology is. The methodology is called a livestock animal. So the big ones would be cattle, pigs, and poultry. But then we should not forget that we have some minor species as well, like goat, sheep, camel, rabbits, fish. So they all have a role to play. And in essence, what this methodology does, it takes low quality plant material that we as humans are not very good at in digesting. It takes them and turns that into high quality, nutrient dense meat, dairy, and egg products. And in this way we can nourish ourselves. as an omnivore type of animal that the human species is, we can get the nutrients from those livestock animals. Now, over the last few decades, not centuries, but decades, we've been running into two issues here. The one issue is that keeping animals has been economically expensive, so it has been economically more expensive than many people were able to afford, and so therefore they were not able to buy the meat, dairy, and egg products that they would need, that traditionally would also be part of their diet, to feed themselves properly. And the second aspect is that with the growing number of animals, we have come into contact with environmental barriers, where some of these production forms of these animals are creating severe environmental burdens, and therefore create the risk of a backlash of environmental conditions. So these are the two limits that we went into. So now we're with the challenge of having to reduce these environmental burdens and at the same time make animal-sourced foods more affordable to the global population. So that more specifically speaking, when we say our challenge is to feed more people properly, the specific challenge is we need to reduce the environmental burden of animals and at the same time make them more affordable to the population. That is the specific challenge.
Is your research showing that the amount of animal protein is not insufficient, or is that also about distribution? There are people that eat too much, and there are also many, many people that have not enough.
So that depends very much on what your view is on what is enough proteins for a healthy diet. And that question is surprisingly difficult to answer. So that requires a little detour in order to understand why this answer is so contentious. But so before going into that detour, generally speaking, it is recommended that an adult person eats between 50 and 60 grams of protein per day in order to meet his personal requirements. And if we would assume that level of 50 to 60 grams per day, then globally we have enough of these proteins available. So we have enough for everybody to eat 50 to 60 grams of protein. So then you would say, okay, well, in that case, it's just a reallocation issue, right? We just need to make sure that everybody has properly access to it. Now, here comes the complication. You need 50 to 60 grams of exactly the right types of protein at exactly the right time of the day. Okay, so it's not enough to eat 60 grams of protein in one evening deal with a big chunk of meat, because your body can only digest 20 grams of protein at any given meal. So you actually need at every meal of the day, preferably even 4 meals a day, you need a good chunk of proteins in there. So you need it evenly spaced throughout the day. And you need those proteins in the right amino acid composition. So the amino acid composition, so a protein is not equal a protein. So you need the right amino acid composition. Pure plant-based proteins do not provide the amino acid composition that we as human beings need. So the more plant proteins you have, the more proteins you need overall in order to meet those threshold amounts. And then comes another complication. If you're a special needs person, so meaning if you're young, or if you're old, or if you're ill, or if you're pregnant, or if you're lactating, or if you have some genetic, metabolic issue in your life, your required amino acid composition might actually be different, individually different from the general profile. So for all these individual situations, you may need different amino acid compositions than that the normal, average, healthy adult requires. So if we don't want to be turning every single citizen of the world into a PhD biologist on understanding exactly what type of amino acid composition this person needs at what times during the day, then the correct answer is we need to oversupply a daily meal with proteins in order to make sure that everybody has received the minimum amount of amino acids that they needed. So that's the long answer. If you got the amino acid composition exactly right 4 times a day, then 60 grams would be enough. But if you don't get it right, then you need 80, 90, 100 grams a day to make sure that you have the required composition at every meal of the day available. And if you then think that for that reason, because I think it's safe to assume that the global population will not all get a PhD in biology, for that reason, we will need an oversupply of proteins on the daily meals, and then we are not, we do not have enough. I mean, depending on what scenario you utilize, we are either 50% short or 80% short or even 100% short of the amount of proteins that we would need in order to feed everybody properly.
And obviously with proteins, milk, eggs, meat, they're all perishable goods. So the logistics of them, moving them around, are also a challenge, and that's especially the case when you move into some of the lower income countries where the road infrastructure and the refrigeration infrastructure is not there. So how does that side of the distribution side of it come into it as well?
Yeah, yes and no. I mean, eggs are actually a surprisingly non-perishable product. Eggs can stay in good condition for quite a while. Having said that, eggs, of course, are also not so easy to transport. So, but eggs are really a wonder food, especially for poorly developed regions, because eggs can be laid by a small animal, but just a chicken. So you don't need large stables and barns and huge operations. So egg production is something that can happen very decentralized. And eggs have been therefore also identified as one of the cornerstones of improving the micronutrient situation, especially of poor areas of the world, in rural areas that are difficult to access. On the dairy side, that is a lot more difficult. On the dairy side, it's not even the issue of the finished product. I mean, you can create buttermilks and cheeses in particular. I mean, the whole thing about creating cheese is in order to make a very healthy dairy product long-term non-perishable. I'm a big connoisseur of 5-year-old Parmesan cheese. I have my whole fridge is stocked with 5-year-old Parmigiano cheese, and it's fantastic. I mean, it's unbelievable. This food is 5 years old. It's not even refrigerated, and it tastes just wonderful. So we have traditional methods of making dairy products non-perishable, but the whole collecting the milk and treating the milk until you have cheese made out of it and so on is a challenge. On the meat side, yes, of course, once you have slaughtered the animal, the meat becomes perishable. But one of the advantages of animals is that you can slaughter them as needed. A plant production, plants, they have to be harvested when the time is right, when harvest period comes, when the sun and the rain and the season of the year decided now is harvest period, and then you have to harvest them right then. And then you have to eat them right then, or you have to store them and process them and so on and so forth to make them non-perishable. But the animals, you slaughter the animal as you need it. And until the moment, while it's still alive, it is a perfect storage mechanism of that meat product. So that's actually the advantage of animals, that you don't need a cold chain. You just slaughter them when you need them.
So if we look across the globe, we've got quite different systems in the global north to the global south in terms of the centralization of meat production and or the decentralization. And as you said, there's the farm somewhere in say rural Africa or remote parts of Asia where there's a few chickens running around the yard, and that's a vitally important protein source. Whereas when you start looking to here in North America, you've got very big animal production units, whether they're poultry, dairy, or beef, that are then shipped out through industrial processing facilities to supermarkets and onto people to eat. How do you, and obviously the environmental footprint of those different systems, as well as the numbers of people they feed, is hugely different. How do you see kind of marrying up those environmental challenges with the need to actually produce this protein efficiently and get it to people to eat to solve these nutritional challenges?
So I'm not quite sure if I understand your question. So from the centralization happens less so on the animal production side. So the animals are still, the animal production is still happening in comparatively small units. So the majority of the animals are being bred and maintained and fed in family-sized operations. Now, of course, in some countries, especially like United States or also Brazil, you have these mega farms with 30,000 animals, 50,000, in a few cases even 100,000 animals. But that's still the exception. Most animal farming is in small decentralized operations around the world. And that actually creates quite a lot of resilience in the system, that you have these decentralized production units. So I don't share your notion that animal production has become centralized. It's compared to any other industry. I mean, take car manufacturing. Right? How many car manufacturing plants do you have in the United States? I mean, a dozen or so. But how many animal production sites do they have in the United States? You have tens of thousands, maybe even hundreds of thousands of animal production sites. So it is a decentralized industry. Now that's different on the abattoir side. On the slaughtering side, there has been a centralization of the slaughterhouse side, and that is probably not a good development for all kinds of reasons. It has been driven by economies of scale, so clearly yes, but it has also been driven by regulatory pressure that communities felt that they didn't want to have a smelly abattoir anymore in their vicinity, so it's been closed down, or permits to expand them or modernize them had not been granted, and so they shut down, and everything moves to these huge facilities. Now, these facilities means that the animals need to travel for longer distances, which in itself is an environmental burden. But it also means that some of the smaller animals, and now I'm talking about sheep and goats, or some specialty breeds, that it's often not economical anymore for them to be grazing or to be used in a certain area, because there is no abattoir that can receive them, because the abattoir may be too far away. It might be 100 miles or 150 miles away, or maybe even further than that. And for a small-sized animals, that's often not a distance that makes it then possible to do that in a lucrative fashion. And so what that means is that many of the ecological niche or the ecological environments where it would be good to have these animals, they're not being serviced by these animals anymore, with various kinds of negative impact on that environment.
That has got me thinking. So I appreciate how you answer that, because I think the big beef feedlots, the big beef dairy farms, etc., tend to generate much more media coverage than globally millions and millions of smallholder farms that are out there. So there probably is a perception where a much greater percentage of the world's animal population lives in these kind of mega farm situations than is actually the fact. And then back to perceptions, there's, the media likes to have things to talk about that keep things simple, that create headlines. So there's a lot of discussion about methane at the moment and the importance of that. There's various different countries. There's a lot of discussion about nitrogen and effluent and those sorts of things. But when you actually look at animal production, you see the relationship between those animals and our food systems is vastly complex. And for centuries and centuries, the animals were the recyclers, they were the fertilizers, they enabled all the other horticultural and farming practices to be efficient. Without the nutrients animals provided, that wouldn't, the world's society and population wouldn't have grown to where it is today. So where do you see, in the broader context, the greatest environmental challenges with livestock production?
So as in any monoculture, right, whether you have whether you do cane sugar plantations that cover, the areas of entire countries, or wheat monoculture plantations, or banana monoculture plantations, if you have an animal monoculture situation, you run the risk of creating an environmental hazard. And the reason is because that concentration of a single species on a single piece of on a small piece of land, it invites the chance of pathogens. It invites the problem of how to effuse and how to distribute again the highly concentrated amount of manure material that gets accumulated in such a case. And the huge amounts of material that need to be trucked there in order to feed the animals and so on. So the larger the concentration of an agricultural production is, and that applies to plants and for animals, the higher is the risk of an environmental hazard unfolding. That's not to say that these cannot be mitigated. So I would think even in highly intensive, let's say, feedlot operation, if it manages its manure properly, why should that be an environmental hazard? But it requires that much more attention. So the more intensify you do something, the more you need to pay attention to risk mitigation. The environmental benefits that animals in our agricultural system can provide, they derive mostly from having decentralized operations, right? So having cows on meadows, free grazing systems where the manure is equally spread, the pigs and chicken operations. You could be using pigs as grazing animals as well, by the way, but I mean, that's typically not done for good reasons. But nonetheless, We could be even there, if we have smaller, more decentralized units, then also their manure situation can be more easily spread across a larger environment and serve as a natural fertilizer. And where you have these natural fertilizers, you can also then get carbon sequestration benefits. You typically get biodiversity benefits. Out of natural fertilizer, you generally have better soil health. You have a larger insect population. The insect population supports a larger bird population. Larger bird and insect population, again, promote the natural biodiversity going on in the whole area. So animals being properly used in as much a decentralized fashion as possible can be a significant contributor of biodiversity services, soil health services, water retention services that are very important benefits to have, and which are typically not appreciated enough in the discussion that we're having.
So what can be done about that? I completely agree that that side of things is underappreciated. It doesn't get the headlines that and the discussion time it deserves. What can we do in that space?
Well, I think two things. So one side is science has to become better at noticing these benefits and measuring these benefits and describing them. So science has in the past not done enough of a job to pay attention to these things and record them and publish them and make them available. So on the scientific side, we have homework to do. And secondly, I think the farming community needs to do good things and talk about them. The farming community, every country I go to, whether it's from Mali to Germany, from New Zealand to United States, you have these absolutely fantastic farming operations where you get true, triple, quadruple wins of profit, people, environment, planet, biodiversity, everything. I mean, these farmers are truly guarding the resources of the land for themselves and for future generations. And their story is not being known enough. So we need to give more visibility, and these farmers themselves need to find more ways to be visible of how they really are the guardian of the resources of the land and the waters and the animals. So there's more storytelling that is necessary here of all the wonderful, great solutions that are being practiced in every corner of the world.
On that note, are there any of those farmer stories that particularly come to mind that you could share?
I don't know. There's so many of them. I mean, let's take one from Annegien ten Have, a farmer in the northeast of Netherlands. She converted her whole pig operation into a farm where the pigs have they have a free flow, so the pigs can easily go into the open, and they're not confined in very small, narrow places. And the whole farm is essentially circular, so the whole farm grows what the pigs eat, and vice versa. The manure is being put out again. They have a biogas thing there. But what I also particularly liked is that Annegien, she genetically selected and created her own breed of pigs. So she did not just take the normal genetics, but she actually created or led by the genetics through the genetic breeding program that she demanded. She kind of created her own brand, her own genetic breed, and put a marketing brand on that. So customers in her environment, in that region where she lives, they recognize that they are buying a piece of meat from this branded product that also has a different genetic composition and a particular way of a circular agricultural system. So this is really closing the loop, not just in terms of having a different agricultural production system, but connecting that all the way to the consumer on the one end, and connecting it to high technology of genetic selection methods on the other hand. This is a story of a fantastic farmer who really understands how to operate the whole chain, how to operate the whole system, using the best of technology and making it a great story to the consumers.
That's a great story, and as you said, it's marrying the environmental side of it, the food production, farming side of it, as well as the business side of it. And would I be wrong to assume that many of the great stories that you have that in as a similar factor, that they're looking across those different parts of the production system or the whole business model?
So the world is an incredibly diverse place, and so you have so many different solutions and so many different farmers who interpret their way of guarding the land for the next generations in so many different ways. But the most successful of those would always include components of a consumer orientation to make sure that this product really has a superior value creation opportunity towards the consumer. The consumer can really taste or feel or knows for sure that this is a different and a better product. So they will always have that consumer orientation element in it, and they will have a strong technology component to it. In order to make best usage of those resources that are being given to them. So I think the best stories always have both of these components in them, yes.
The politics of protein production, of meat production, has become much more divisive over the last decade or so. How do you and in some ways you've got both sides looking at the farmer. I've never met a farmer who doesn't want to actually look after their land, who's actively out there to try and damage their land, and I've met many of them. And likewise, there's a lot of people who are very passionate about the environment, that see reducing animal production as the solution. And I would say both groups care deeply about the land, but they've become divided into quite different and often not quite combative, but also they don't get on very well. How do you see that political debate going or unfolding?
So I think, first of all, what you say is very important to recognize. All sides really want the same thing. I don't know a single farmer who is out there saying, well, I intentionally ruin my land because I don't care what comes after me. And the same is also for industry. I don't see that agribusiness industry is a short-term exploiter of, the devil may care what comes after me. Anybody I know in this industry is very mindful of the fact that we're producing food. The food has to be safe, it has to be secure, and nobody wants to live with a blemish on their coat that they've been ruining the planet in the process. So I think across the board, we all want the same thing. We want a healthy, nutritious, sufficient meal that does not ruin the planet while we produce that meal. Now, why the debate has become so divisive and so polarized, I'm not quite sure. I'm also not sure whether we've become more polarized than any other field. It seems like polarization is has become a feature of our societies. And I mean, you start a war in some corner of the world, and the next day you have only either people who are completely for it or other people who are completely on the other side. And suddenly, within days, it's already not possible to have a middle ground position. So it's that is a question to a sociologist of why the world reacted towards an abundance of information thanks to the internet. It reacted with extreme polarization, and I don't know what the cultural tool is to overcome this, but that's really a task for sociologists to figure out. So back to our group, I think we just need to find ways to stay in dialogue and engage in dialogue. I was last week at a large meat event in Germany, where we're inside the meeting. We had 500 executives just talking about the future of the industry, and I was one of the keynote speakers. And outside, we had Greenpeace running very large protests, and so a couple of typical Greenpeace type of activities, huge posters, and so on and so forth. But I then actually made a point to go outside of the hall and talk to some of these Greenpeace activists. And I have to say, we had a very polite and very open and curious-driven discussion. I could not say that it was impossible to have a discussion with these Greenpeace protesters on the other side, outside of the hall. On the contrary, we had a very good and constructive discussion. We had different viewpoints, but I took some good ideas away from that discussion, and I hope they did as well. So until the sociologists come up with a better solution of how we're going to conduct our societies, I think what we need to do is we need to seek the dialogue and, first of all, really understand that we all want the same thing.
I don't have an answer to the polarization side of things, but that is something that you see increasingly. I think that's another huge challenge for our societies, but probably beyond our expertise, as you mentioned. In terms of creating those dialogues and having, I guess, people who don't necessarily agree with each other speak together. And on a personal note, I think you frequently, if you go into a room where you agree with everyone, you don't particularly challenge yourself or learn very much. And when you do start to speak to people who you don't agree with, you often do learn more. So I think that's highly useful. How do you see, from the meat industry side of things, or the protein or the human health side of things, any ways of trying to broaden those conversations to include more people and get those other people in the room?
I think traditionally the meat industry has been reluctant to communicate. It's a traditional posture of the meat industry not to talk with the public. And I don't know, maybe it sort of just accidentally happened like this. But you could also think maybe it has to do with the fact that it's just one of those things that's it's a bit awkward to talk about, because the reality is, in order to be able to serve a piece of meat in the local butchery or in the local supermarket, the connection to the cute animal that's been standing outside in the meadows beforehand is that somebody had to kill this animal. And since this is an awkward step in the life of the animal, maybe the traditional default position was, let's not talk about it, let's just do it, you know. And so what I observe among agribusiness industry in meat related sector is they really don't quite know how to talk with the general public. They're kind of learning how to do this, because they've now seen that they're performing a vital function for society, but society has reduced, or in some cases maybe even totally withdrawn, the social license to operate. And without a social license to operate, you cannot operate a business, whether it's legal or not. So what I keep on telling captains of the industry is, not just now, but you know, write it into your task book for the next 100 years, that every business, every industry, and every society needs to continuously make clear why it should have a social license to operate. Because without that social license to operate, you don't have a business. And I think the industry has woken up to this need. And so it's learning now how to communicate. It's learning how to bring out its messages. It's learning how to be transparent. And I think this is showing first very good results. What I find completely laughable is that some of the opponents of the meat industry, or meat or animal in general, that the opponents say that there would be massive meat industry lobbying efforts. That's completely laughable, because I know for certain that doesn't exist. The meat industry does not launch massive lobbying efforts. It doesn't know how to do it. It doesn't have the profit margins to do it. To compare the meat industry with the tobacco industry or with the fossil oil fuel industry is a that's just completely ridiculous notion, because the meat industry is not organized like that. It doesn't have the profit margins to do this, and it has traditionally never done that. So the industry is beginning to find its voice towards society, and that's a good thing.
Over the last 10 or so years, there's been a lot of innovation into alternative ways of making proteins, be that various fermentation mechanisms or cell cultures. Where do you see those? And obviously with those businesses, there's been a lot of investment, huge amounts of investment in some cases, and then the challenges of actually turning those products into profitable, and those businesses into profitable businesses. Where do you see that technology and that innovation fitting into the food system?
So most of it has a proper place in the food system and is to be encouraged and to be welcomed. The overall challenge to create to have a more micronutrient rich nutrition on our tables is so large that we should not be discounting or should not be pushing away any single method for it. So overall, it is to be welcomed and to be appreciated. Now, having said that, we also need to understand what are the likely technological limitations to this over the next, foreseeable 20 to 30 years. So when we look at alternative meats, they come in at least 3 broad categories. So the one is the classic tofu burger, or these days it would be more likely to be a pea burger. So these you take plant proteins and you do a ultra high amount of processing on these plant proteins in order to make them look like a piece of meat. So this is not a new technology. It's been around forever, and it has its market. But let's face it, it's an ultra high processed food, in order to make it taste anywhere remotely palpable, you need to put an enormous amount of colorants and deodorants and stabilizers and into this type of food. So most people, rightly so, will say, well, why don't I just take the real thing? At least that's not processed. So so that's one part of it. And the second on this issue is, once you're done with all that processing, the cost is more or less the same again. So you're not even getting a cost benefit. The same is, by the way, true for the environmental benefit. So once you adjust all these foods for on a nutrient-based basis comparison of environmental burdens, they're more or less all come out the same thing. So you're not gaining any money, you're not gaining any environmental benefits out of that. The second category of alternative meats are where you express the proteins from fungi or algae or from bacteria, right? So you get microorganisms to create an animal-like kind of protein. So this as well, we've been having this, for instance, the market leader in that is corn from United Kingdom, a chicken meat replacement product. And it's there too. We've done it for decades. The technology is well matured, we know how to do it, and it has its market. Some people like it, most people don't. But again, there's really no cost benefit to this sort of product. It's not cheaper to do, and on the environmental assessment side, it performs slightly better, yes, but not a magnitude better. So if we can harness microorganisms to express proteins that then become ingredients to food, that's to be welcomed. You know, it's fantastic if we can, for instance, use these ingredients to fortify dishes and you know, artificially enrich them with proteins and make them more nutritious. Fantastic, you know, absolutely welcomed. Now, the third category is the idea of creating cellularly cultured meat, right? So we're creating a meat that is actually an animal cell, and from that create not a replacement product, but you actually recreate the cell of the meat muscle. Now, from what I hear from my colleagues, this technology has no opportunity, it has no chance to realize itself on any scale of economics over the next 20 or 30 years. This is not going to become a mass market product. It is probably viable for some ultra special products. So the things that are always being talked about is the foie gras, you know, an artificial liver, or yellowfin tuna. So these kind of things, you know, is a very, very expensive luxury products that at the same time have all kind of ethical problems with them. If we can replace them with cellular based, wonderful, you know, why not? But is that going to become a mass application product? My colleagues tell me not in a distant sight. It's, you know, we never know what happens in 30 years, but with what we know about technology today, this does not have the viability to become a mass market application.
Thank you very much for that. Is there, we're getting near the end of our time, so is there anything that you would like to add that we haven't already discussed?
We touched on it, but I would like to emphasize one more thing more explicitly. When we're talking about the environmental impacts of an animal and indirectly, therefore, of meats and eggs and dairy, then these impacts happen along 4 different dimensions, or mainly 4 different dimensions. So one dimension is biodiversity, one dimension is soil health, the third dimension is water management, and the fourth is climate. Now, every kind of animal, so poultry, pigs, and cattle, they have different types of impacts, both negative and positive impacts, along each of the 4 dimensions. And the reality of it is, the complexity of it is that they're not trade-offable. You know, you cannot say, okay, I can somehow take a negative climate impact and trade that off against a positive soil health impact, because we're talking about different units. So we need to accept that the environmental dimensions of animals in our global food system are real, but they're multidimensional, and we need to manage every dimension. We need to manage and monitor every dimension by itself, and respect that every dimension needs to be monitored and managed independent of each other. And when we need to accept that each animal can have in each of these dimensions either positive or negative, or even both at the same time, impacts along each of these dimensions. We need to accept the multidimensionality of that system. Otherwise, we will for sure get it wrong to define the right animal production system for the right kind of environment.
So we need to learn more about the complexity of these systems and embrace that complexity wholeheartedly.
There is no shortcut to it. We live in an age of wanting to have very brief and simple and plausible solutions, but unfortunately, this is not an area where we can just sort of, use one dimension and optimize everything into that direction. It will bite us back on the other dimensions. We need to accept that this is complex, and that if we do not appreciate and respect that complexity, we're most likely get wrong solutions that come and bite us in other ways.
Yeah, thank you very, very much for joining me today.
Absolutely. Appreciate very much the discussion.
You've been listening to The Ash Cloud with me, Ash Sweeting, in conversation with Peer Ederer, recorded in California in December 2023.